Morning, Jenny.
Hey there, Patrick.
I am very excited for our conversation today. So, for those of you that are listening in today, um, Jenny and I are going to talk about some of the things that we have in common as far as our love of talking about stress and burnout and how that shows up in the workplace, and squarely focused on her new book, Work Smart. And I had come to learn about your book and wanted to reach out really just to have a fun conversation because we have come to parallel some of those spaces and have a different, but not all too different career trajectory. So I thought we could talk about some of those things as an intro today.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's been really fun to see our paths kind of intersect at different points, and meeting back up again in this way is really actually lovely. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah. So, a quick background about me, and then maybe I can have you talk about your background as well, and folks will note the similarity. So, I have a business degree, so I actually worked in management for about 5 years before taking a sharp left into the counseling field. So, I've been a psychotherapist here in Chapel Hill for 15 years now. And then after a strong clinical career and including some entrepreneurship in that, exited our clinic that we had here and have been squarely focused on workplace resilience for the last 5 or 6 years. And I was wondering if you could just introduce your background a little bit as well, which parts of that somewhat mirror.
Yeah, sure. I always tell people too, my path is not linear in the slightest. So I did not start out wanting to be a doctor, but I did go to medical school, train to be a physician, and I did a PhD in neurophysiology. So
Mhm.
really everything brain and behavior has been pretty obsessive for me for, I don't even want to say how many years, 30 years now. Um, but like you, I really became entranced by the clinical work, which was not how I started out. So went and did psychiatry, psychotherapy for over 15 years. Also having an entrepreneurship journey. I call it a solopreneur,
Mhm.
for about 9 years. And then I also exited my group practice and then went on to do some really different things. So, working as a national C suite healthcare executive, which was very different. And then going out and becoming a consultant. And then having a great relationship with one of my clients. And they asked me to be a co founder of their startup. So I have done that. It's a healthcare company as well. And I like to kind of have a work portfolio now. So a little consulting, a little coaching, a little clinical work, co-founder, and then more recently becoming an author. But I find it for where I am right now, having a portfolio keeps it really fresh and I don't burn out. So we talk about burnout later. That's been one of my strategies to avoid burnout as a clinician and a leader.
Yeah, and that balance is certainly um, very much alive for me and helps in keeping things fresh and curious for me. I'm wondering through all of these different lenses, how you were able to capture that over the last, 30 years that really helped spark the ideas behind wanting to write this book. And maybe even, and you do talk about it in the book, about a
Mm-hmm.
specific moment where you couldn't not write the book.
It's a great question. When I think about sparking curiosity or sparking ideas, I really think a lot about creativity, and that's a part of the book as well. And before I went into medicine, I was a musician.
Mhm.
So my first love was actually music, and I played, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours a day all through high school. And it wasn't really towards end of college that I took the curve off into pre-med. So creativity has always had a really important part in my life, although I think I ignored it and
Mhm.
downplayed it and was not encouraged to pursue it after college. And so it kind of lay dormant for a while. And so sparking that creativity again was very important for me, and especially during the pandemic, that was really what got me through, was rediscovering creativity. I picked up a new instrument. I got back into music. I started fiddling around with all kinds of crazy art projects, and I really rediscovered it, and that was important.
Mhm.
Pause. So when the opportunity came to write a book, it was like a very intuitive yes, which is a little unusual for me. Like I'm typically more of a planner, and someone that was a coach of mine came to me and she said, when I coached you, I always said you should write a book, and here's an opportunity. And I was like, oh, I'll take it away and think about it very seriously. And then 30 seconds later, I was like, yes, I will write a book. So it was really a very intuitive moment of saying yes to something, which I really honestly didn't know what I was getting into. But I had that, I think the spark was there because I had been cultivating the creative attitude for a while. And so because I had that, I felt like I could say yes. And I really wanted to learn how to tell better stories. I love to read, and I felt like it was a chance for me to learn how to be a better communicator and a better storyteller.
That's great. I'm wondering if you were talking about cultivating creativity, which probably helped a lot in this process. And I have my own bias around creativity looks like painting and singing and instruments. And through my own entrepreneurship journey, I've come to understand creating as the part of creativity can be something totally different. And the muscles around that can be a lot of fun to develop. I'm wondering if you could just speak, maybe even throughout your writing process, how you nurtured the creative side so that when you are delivering the creativity through writing, it was there for you when you needed it.
Great question. And you're right. You're absolutely right. It's not just what we think about like classical arts as being creativity. Creativity can be very physical. Physical movement can be extraordinarily creative.
Mhm.
Other types of problem solving can be very creative. I tell a fun story in the book about a colleague of mine who um, was in a frat, and he was in a frat and he had to solve a problem, which was the guys didn't want to come to the meetings. So he looked around and he tried to find an idea, and he heard about an idea to give playing cards. Every time you came, you got a playing card, and when you got five, you had a poker hand, and then the best poker hand would win a prize, which I think was beer because it was a frat. But anyway, the next thing that was really cool about his story was he took that and he creatively problem solved it around to take it to the next level. So he was in Vegas, picked up some Playboy naughty playing cards, took that back to the frat, and all of a sudden there was this whole other level to the game. And then he took it to the next level, and he had a job interview, and he was probably 21, and he told the story in a like official job interview about how he got these naughty playing cards, which was a big risk. So
Sure.
it was a great example for me of like how to think creatively that's not like a traditional art form.
Yeah.
But to your question about how to cultivate it, um, I've always been a dabbler. So for me, it's just allowing myself to dabble. But I recently participated in a group reading a book called The Artist Way by
Mm.
Julia Cameron from the 80s. And it really gives you practices to help cultivate that mindset. And she talks about some of the practices she recommends are something called morning pages, where you write for 3 pages every day, and it can be literally anything, but you have to do 3 pages. And I thought that was a really strange concept, but I tried it and I did actually find it quite effective. So that's one of her recommendations. And then she talks about this idea of having an artist within each of us and nurturing that artist,
Mhm.
and how you have an artist date with yourself. And the date is to go out and do something different. It can be anything. It can be learning something new. It could be going to a new place, but you have to do it by yourself, and you have to do it without distraction.
Mhm.
And I actually found that to be really hard. Like giving
Yeah.
ourselves permission to take a morning and just go somewhere random and try something new, like that's surprisingly difficult for me. And that's a practice that I'm still trying to nurture. Because I still find that hard to give yourself permission to play. It's really to
Hmm.
play, like giving
Hmm.
yourself permission to do things which as a child would be totally normal and acceptable. But as an adult, somehow we don't let ourselves do that anymore.
Yeah, and I'm wondering with leaders and empaths if that is sometimes even more difficult.
Well, I know you work, Patrick, with physicians, and speaking as
Mhm.
a physician, I mean, we are really hard on ourselves. Like we have been kind of beaten to the ground in our training about the responsibility of what we do. And I don't see many physicians give themselves the permission to play as if it would detract from the very serious professional work that they do, when in fact it probably would help them quite a bit in their professional work if they allowed themselves to play.
Yeah, and well, we can talk a little bit more about this later, but I really appreciated when you were talking in chapter 4 about the cult of busyness, right? And if we are engaging in a corporate society in which even rest is looked negatively upon, and that we've internalized that in really strong ways. So if rest is difficult, play, which seems even more difficult to engage in, must be further away.
I love the term "the cult of busyness." It's a term that's really popped up in the last decade, but you could see it even as early as the 1980s. Kind of this
Mm-hmm.
idea of being busy as a status symbol or a
Mm-hmm.
prestige. Like, who's busier?
Yeah.
Well, oh, I'm busier. I'm more important. I'm so busy. Um, so people, I think, are starting to get the idea of rest. That rest is physiologically needed to work and to be productive and to be happy and healthy and all those things. But I think the play part is further.
Mm-hmm.
And when people, what I notice in my peers and colleagues is they struggle with the play part. And so when they have leisure time, it is either filled with busy things, or honestly, people are filling it with substances.
Yeah.
I see a lot. I don't know if you see this with the folks you work with. There's a pretty big rise, I think, in alcohol use, and now with like marijuana becoming more accepted and legalized, and even psychedelics and other things. And I see a lot of people turn to that as their play, as opposed to like a more create. Not to say that they're mutually exclusive, but I see them turn to the substances as opposed to other ways to kind of play.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, substance abuse was the entry to my field.
Mm.
And I actually used to teach the class here in town for master's level counselors on substance abuse. My doctoral dissertation looked at how trauma and emotional distress predicts prescription drug abuse. But I think the greater story of what you're talking about is how our culture has so combined those two things, right? So to go to a yoga class that is also serving mimosas, right? It's kind of combining this concept of alcohol and this healthy thing. And it seems more difficult to separate those out, which then, supports that substance abuse even more so, and that we need substances as a way to take care of ourselves.
And there's some interesting brain science that the receptors in our brain for THC, so one of the components of marijuana, may activate similar brain activity as play states. So
Mm-hmm.
it may be that people, for example, with THC, feel like they get that play state. But I would argue that it's a substitute for the play state. It doesn't really engage your brain in the same way. It maybe feels similar, but it's actually not engaging it in that kind of creative process. Now, some people would argue with me and say, no, THC and substances are the gateway to more creativity. And maybe that's been their experience. But I would argue that the substances are probably a replica of it rather than the actual thing.
Mm-hmm. And I've had a lot of conversation with folks over the years, more so when I was in psychotherapy,
Mm-hmm.
doing mild to moderate substance abuse work with folks. how healthy it is to still develop the muscle of engaging with something like play, or the muscle of engaging in relationships, and that substances are often they smooth over the bridge for that, which then kind of retracts those muscles a little bit more.
I never thought of it that way. I like that. That's a nice metaphor.
Yeah. I'm wondering, sticking on creativity just for another moment, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the relationships maybe that you saw personally throughout the writing of this book, but really for folks who would be digesting the book around stress and high levels of stress and the impacts that that has on creativity, specifically in problem solving, engaging with folks in different ways.
Yeah. So, my take on stress, and this is kind of my psychiatry hat, is that, a little bit of stress is okay, right? A little bit of stress is activating the sympathetic nervous system. It's, preparing you to take action. It sometimes creates a little tension to kind of help move you along. So it's a normal part of being a human. And I think some people have forgotten that, and they think all stress is bad. And I would just say that stress is not inherently bad. It's just having the right amount and using it at the right time. So most people are existing in the stress state a lot, way more than they should be. And so they're not balancing the sympathetic nervous system with the parasympathetic, nervous system, which is the rest and recharge. And that's what we activate with breathing exercises and yoga and all those things. So they're in a state of imbalance, and their sympathetic system is on high drive. And when that happens in the short term, long-term stress sets in. And that's when you get the cortisol hormone, which is a hormone that affects your entire body. And again, it's there to protect you in times of stress. So it's normal that humans might encounter times of stress in their lives, right? Like if you're, out in the jungle and you run out of food for a while, like it's normal to be stressed. Or if you're around a pack of lions for a week, like it's normal to be stressed. So it's there to protect you. But when you activate it as a chronic physiological state, it's extraordinarily harmful to your body and your brain. So I think our culture, we really are pretty disconnected from our bodies a lot of the time. I know I am disconnected, and I still struggle with that a lot. And we think about stress as a mental process, but it's really a body process. And that cortisol long term will erode your muscles. It will erode your immune system. It will erode a lot, and it will make you very susceptible to illness, premature aging, cancer, all sorts of things. So I think about stress a lot in the physiological sense. But the one thing that's interesting about humans is we have the ability to work on our own thoughts. So through understanding our own thoughts, we can impact our body. And so by understanding stress at a kind of cognitive level, and that's what that's what psychotherapists do, right? Is sometimes we help connect the brain with the body.
Yeah.
So we have the ability to act on our own body and our own, and I think that's fascinating. And learning more about things like yoga and meditation, I mean, those are more Eastern practices to tackle that problem.
I was noticing and tracking my own physiology and thoughts when you were mentioning the practice of writing 3 pages in the morning.
Yeah.
And just listening to you, I noticed my body especially engaged in a stress response. And what that reminded me is research behind flow states as well, right? This concept of we lose all track of time and space because we are so immersed. And what I've come to learn over the decade of studying is that's not solely a cognitive response, but it is our emotional system and our physiological system in concert with our physiology. And that there's this struggle that needs to take place, right? So a sympathetic struggle, which is stress. And then it's actually right as that kind of crest, that's where that flow states So just, yes, highlighting again that stress actually helps us do those things. It is natural when, if somebody's banging on your door, that you go into this sympathetic response. It's a preparation response, similar to what you were talking about of being in the woods, but that if we are living at a too high or over threshold state, that can keep us locked into worrying that a bear is chasing us, or that there's chronic stress everywhere. I'm wondering from a workplace standpoint, kind of what you've seen over the years as far as ways in which what's coming at folks creates that really high level of stress, and maybe even talk through it. And you talk about this wonderfully in the book around some boundary setting that can help protect us, right? So we can't keep out everything, but just differentiating what are the things that we can do versus those that we can't always keep out.
Yeah, I think the modern workplace, or I call it like the traditional office, there were a lot of things that were happening that are happening now for most people, I say, who are working in knowledge worker fields where they're not, manually doing things all day long. There's a couple of things that I think contribute to the high stress level, and learning how to set the boundary on them can help bring that stress down. So one of the things is something I think everyone can relate to, which is multitasking. If you think you're a good multitasker, I hate to break the news to you, like, multitasking is a myth. Your brain does not multitask. Your brain rapidly shifts between tasks, but it actually doesn't multitask. So when you do more than one thing at a time and you're rapidly shifting back and forth, you dramatically lose productivity.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you're doing 2 tasks at the same time, you give about 40% productivity to each and you lose 20% to the shifting. You're doing 3 things at a time, you give about 20% to each of tasks and you lose 40%.
Wow.
So now if you can imagine most people sitting at their desk or their computer, and you got an email and then someone Slacks you, and then you're looking at a screen of something else. I mean, already, boom, those are 3 things. You've already lost 40% of productivity switching.
Yeah.
So if you multiply that by thousands of stimuli that are coming at you, you're just wasting a lot of time and energy, honestly. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing to say no to is multitasking. I think it's easier said than done. But this strategy of chunking like tasks can really help. So I always use email as the example because that's the one that everybody kind of, complains about. But you could put Slack or whatever you want to put in there. If you chunk your emails together, meaning you sit down and you do them all, and then you close it, and then you go back and open it again and then close it, turn off notifications. Most people notice a dramatic improvement in productivity, like pretty dramatic. That's a simple strategy so the saying no to constant communication through email or Slack. Now, that is hard because the culture around you is not going to do that. So you have to get on board with your manager or your team if you're a leader and say, I'm going to try this experiment. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to check email 3 times a day. And if you need me in between that, you have to text me or call me or something. And it feels really weird, but I can guarantee that if you can master it or at least improve it, it makes a big, big difference. So that's one thing. I think PTO, time off, weekend vacation, whatever you want to call it, you need unplug time. That's the other big one that's really hard for people. I've experimented with a bunch of different ways to do this well. including, spending a lot of time signing off to people to make sure it's really clear what's going to happen while I'm away. I put, I don't know if you ever gotten this from me, Patrick, but when I'm out, I put a out of office on my email that has a graph of like how it helps your brain to be unplugged. So I'm kind of making a point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
If
used
I'm
to do it
unplugged.
with something similar called deep work sessions.
Yeah.
And I would put an away message when I'm, blocking out all of the world. But in that away message, I would have, a video link, not one of my videos, but Cal Newport, the gentleman that created this, for them to go check it out. And there's a number of organizations that set those, but also have conversations similar about scheduling deep work on their calendar so that everybody knows these are the two times a week where I will be unreachable for 90 minutes because I'm just trying to focus.
That's awesome. And then I think the final thing I like to talk about with people is saying no, like knowing yourself as a human being and saying no to things that really don't work for you as like a human, like your body. So for example, for me, I am useless at 3 p.m. Like about 3 to 5 p.m., my brain is just, my circadian rhythm tanks. I'm just not very good. So saying no to meetings after 3 is really hard, especially when you work with people from the West Coast. So, I write about in the book, I had to really connect with the why behind the saying no to make it a consistent practice. And the why was, well, what happens if I show up to a meeting when my brain is kind of done? I'm not very effective and I might be irritable. I probably have a bad energy. People probably don't enjoy being with me. So, like, what is that really adding to the work if I'm showing up like that and impacting everyone else in a bad way? Like, I'm not really being very helpful. So, connecting back to that why of like, it's not just about me, it's about everybody else. Like, that helped me like keep that boundary, which is very hard to keep.
Yeah. As you were, listing out these 3 things, the chunking, the time off, that other boundary setting piece, there's the setting of the boundary, and then there's the holding. And I'm sure this has come up a lot in your conversations with folks over years. It's certainly come up. The idea of setting and holding are very different things, and the holding is really emotional, right? And we place value on ourselves, or for those around us, maybe elevating somebody else's value. I'm wondering just what a brief conversation that someone could have with themselves about how do I encourage myself to hold these boundaries because it's good for me?
I think it's a practice. So, like yoga, you're never perfect. We're all human. I mean, I wrote a freaking book on the topic and I'm practicing it all the time, right? Like you're never perfect. Life changes. Sometimes your body changes, right? With COVID, people saw that. They got sick and they needed more rest and they couldn't do what they had to. So things change. I think it's like I remind myself a lot that I'm human. And as a physician, you're kind of taught almost like you're not human. You're supposed to be superhuman. You can never make a mistake, for example. So like I am human. And that's what, again, as a physician, for example, like that makes me a good physician. Being human is what makes me a good physician. It's not all the algorithms and the training and the, blah, blah, blah. Like, yes, that's important. But what matters to heal somebody is the human part. I really believe that. So the human piece of who I am is what matters most to other humans. So in accepting my own humanity, that's how I'm showing up in a way for other people that will support them. So for me, it's about me, but like how I'm showing up in the world that I keep going back to and like accepting my own vulnerabilities or failures or mistakes. The more I can do that, I feel like I show up better for other people. And I get feedback that is inspiring for other people to hear that. And so the book was an exercise in vulnerability. I have stuff in there I hadn't shared, with my family, with other people. Like I'm still not, you know, I'm not sure how that's received. So it was an exercise in vulnerability. I really had to stretch myself to put that out there. But I think I have to practice what I preach. So I'm trying and practicing and being like kind to myself and just saying like, I'm human, right? Like if I weren't human, I wouldn't be very useful.
But I appreciate you saying about practicing what I preach, and that also includes the messy side of us, right? So that it's, given my roles and responsibilities in the world, practicing what I preach is at the top, and some of that looks like when I fall on my face, how do I graciously have conversations about things like that?
Yeah, and I think for women and other underrepresented groups in the workforce, I think it's even harder because
Mhm.
I always felt like I had to be, the best, zero mistakes. I had to look perfect. I had to be perfect if I was going to make it. And so I think we feel that pressure sometimes even more, perhaps, that we can't be human. We have to be superhuman. And you say fall on your face. I'm laughing. I have a story in the book. I actually did fall on my face once. So I was in my office, and you remember my office. I had this beautiful office. I loved my office. And there was I would dress. I had a dress, and I had these heels, and there was a fire drill. And I was with a long-term psychotherapy patient who was actually a very complicated person. And I had to go down the stairs with my patient, and I fell down the stairs in my heels, like in front of my patient, flat on my face. So that's like you said, sometimes you like literally fall on your face
During a fire drill of all things.
with your psychodynamic psychotherapy patient.
Yeah, what a great moment to practice some grace for your client and in front of your client as well.
Exactly. And I do think actually in some ways that built our relationship a little bit because she saw me in a more human light, I think, than she had.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. There's, I'm still thinking about multitasking. That is something that is so pervasive in our culture. Something personally I try to work on, even just trying to identify what those are, separating those out, but it's really difficult. And really, you speak about this in the book, the cognitive overload just taking that alone, right? That
Mhm.
trying to do these multiple things requires so much more of our brains, and yet there's a limit to that. And so I'm wondering if you could talk through a little bit about the cognitive overload that happens. And there's a really great piece about silence, and just wondering if you could weave this concept of silence into that as well.
Sure. So I think cognitive overload is something that people can relate to pretty easily these days, that it's just information at all times coming in and multitasking and multiple medias of information. And so I think people feel that at a pretty visceral level. The one fact I like to share with people to kind of drive the point home is that our brains have something called working memory. So we
Mm,
have kind of this idea of a sandbox in our brain where we can put things to manipulate them. But studies have shown over and over again that working memory can only hold like 4 or 5 things at a time. And you can try to cram more in there, but it's not going to stick. And you're not going to really successfully work on it. And so the example is a phone number. Even a 7-digit phone number can be hard to remember. So we chunk the information in ways that we can remember. So a number that's 555-1776, we don't remember 555-1776. We remember 3 5s and American Revolution, right?
yeah.
So chunking information is how people who have incredible memories, they're people who can do this for a living, right? They can do amazing feats of memory. One of the tricks is chunking information. So we can't hold tons of information in our brain at one given time. Um, So I think people are always surprised by that. The optimal number of things in working memory is probably about 5 things, 3 to 5 things.
And I'm contrasting that with this current culture that I feel like we're in, where there's almost an addiction to information, right? I'm going to have the news on over here. I'm going to be listening to a podcast over here. I have whatever social, right? And it's just, we are choosing to overwhelm our system specifically with information and the consequences of that.
Yeah, and there's a kind of an adjacent topic I wrote about around the fear of missing out. So FOMO drives a lot of that behavior. So regret aversion is the psychological term. That's a little bit of a tangent, but yeah, I think we do it to ourselves, but it's very culturally bound. So we have to work against the culture if we want to get past it. But you mentioned silence. This was something I actually learned a lot about when I was writing, and it's one of my personal, practices I have to work on, which is to shut up and stop talking, because I like to talk. That's why I'm a psychiatrist, I think. So silence is really powerful. If you've ever worked with a leader who can use silence, I mean, I think, Patrick, you're pretty good at adding silence. I'm not as good at that. I have to work on it. But leaders who can really listen and inject silence, I mean, it can be unbelievably powerful. And learning how to listen, to shut up and actually listen to people was one of the hardest things I learned as a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
When I trained in psychotherapy, how to do active listening, it can be trained. I mean, I would say I was not innately good at it at all. And the training of a psychotherapy, really, really helped me with that. But you don't have to be a psychotherapist to learn how to actively listen. So I think if you can be silent and shut up and really be a good active listener, it dramatically improves the quality of your relationships, both professionally and personally. But it's hard. It's a practice, and some people are better at being silent than others. And it's also something that, if done well, can really help with things like equity and letting voices that typically haven't been heard be heard. But you have to shut up and get out of the way sometimes. Instead of praising someone, sometimes you actually just have to stop talking and give them the space to talk.
I'm wondering if in your research for this, if you came across anything that really connected the stress response with our ability to be silent, right? So I think when so many people listen, they are really active in their listening because they're preparing, right? So I want to be able to tease out active listening isn't actively preparing your response, right?
No.
And that we actually have to maybe downregulate a little bit to actually take in what somebody's saying.
That's a great point. Yes. No, it's not just preparing to talk. So another metaphor I've been using is that communication is more like tennis than golf.
Mm-hmm.
It's an active conversation back and forth. And a lot of what a good tennis player will do is carefully watch and anticipate the other person. So, like you said, it's not always about what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Sometimes it's really like, what are they doing and saying? And giving yourself the space to actually listen. So what some of the tricks that I learned as a therapist, I'm sure you learned too, are like, if you really listen to someone and then you can reflect back to them what they have said, that forces you to stop preparing your own agenda. So reflection is a great tool that people can learn, or clarification is a great tool that I think is relatively easy for people to learn. And that kind of forces you to stop thinking about your own response. But I think what you're getting at is more like calming and grounding yourself so that you can receive. I think maybe that's more what you're getting at.
I think all of that is really wonderful. And I was actually having some flashbacks you were talking about, or making some assumptions about my training, which you were spot on about. In my first year, we would be seated in front of the class with one other person, and you would be in the therapist in training role, and you would just be reflecting for 20 minutes. And to do that in the bubble of you're new to this, your peers, was really intense. And it's that uncomfortability and the habitual nature of that that gets you ready to do that in real time when people are then giving you content of their story, which is really intense, which then also brings up your activation system. And a lot of leaders that I've been talking to, especially in the last, I don't know, probably 6 to 9 months, who are leading with empathy, and yet they are being washed over by these really intense stories and struggles that COVID has really presented for folks.
Right. And I think the adjacent topic to that, which I really think is powerful, is we have empathy fatigue. Like there's a limit to empathy. And again, as a therapist, we train on, like, you have a limit. And so choosing the most important conversations or moments of the day to have that empathy, sometimes you can't be empathetic to everybody, right? And what I love about working virtually is that there are kind of these robot helper tech tools to help us shut up and listen. So you can mute yourself. If you're tempted to talk like me, like just mute yourself. And then you have to go, unmute yourself to talk. And it really, for me, helps. So what I love about virtual is you can, if you're at home, there's a lot of ways I can calm myself down at home before I get on a virtual meeting with somebody. I can sit on the floor. I can go for a walk. I can pet the dog. There's a lot of things I can do. If I were sitting in my office, I couldn't do those things. And I find that virtual work, it's a lot easier for me to ground myself going into a meeting than if I'm physically together. I get very, like you said, activated, excited, wound up. And I find it much harder in person to kind of downregulate. And so for me, one of the best things about virtual work is the ability to use tech or to use practices to really prepare myself to go into conversations with other people. So I think that's one of the blessings of virtual work for people who do get very kind of excited and wound up and have trouble calming down when they're together with other people.
It reminds me of how many folks leverage that excitement by checking all the last minute emails before going into maybe a call, right? So there's all of this activation, and instead of doing this, they just kind of try to discharge it by doing all of these things. And similar to you, I like to take that 5 minutes. So even before setting up for this, I had some classical music playing in my ears, and including some binaural beat in the background that was actually meant to lower my activation, to kind of create a lower tone, knowing that my system would very much be excited for this conversation. But that's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, I had similar this morning before we spoke. My routine is to go through all my emails and all of that early. So I did that, and then I was kind of activated. And so then I stepped aside, I closed everything, and I did a 15-minute yoga, and I came back to a desk that was closed and, wanted to be ready to speak with you. So yeah, it's a practice, and it's really hard. And it's so tempting that, I have 5 minutes. Let me go get this email done. But you're really just setting yourself up to, I don't want to say fail, but you're setting yourself up to show up to that meeting in the wrong cognitive and physical space if you do that. But it's tempting.
You speak in the book about this new virtual balance that we are all trying to sort out. And my experience of talking with folks over the last 3 years is some folks are really set up well to work virtually, and some folks really need the interactions. and often to help downregulate them or upregulate them, or healthy amounts of accountability. I know that I have to leave the house to do certain types of things. And
Right.
one of my cues is when I want to start dusting underneath the bed, like I need to leave the house. But just wondering if you could speak of just what was uncovered for you in the writing of this book as it has to do with virtual work, and how individuals or teams can try to get this right.
Yeah, what I learned, and this wasn't what I thought when I started, but what I learned was that we're all trying to rush to the solution because we feel like, oh, there's an answer. We'll just get there. But the reality is, by rushing to the answer, we're not really asking the bigger question. And the bigger question is, what are we doing? Like, what is the work we're trying to do here? Like, what is the actual work? And then the second question, who are the actual human beings that we have to do the work? And I find that when you can answer those two questions, the answers come fairly easily. So if you say, the work to be done is we're going to design tables and chairs, and we have a group of people and they're all extroverted and they all live in tiny cramped apartments and they like to be together. The answer may be you need to sit in an office together every day of the week and physically build things together. If you tell me we have, our task is to create a digital health solution, and we have a bunch of coders who are introverts and they need to be together a little bit, but they really want to do a lot of independent work. Well, maybe 20% of the time should be in person. And if you say, well, we're all over the country, okay, then maybe that 20% is every 4 to 6 weeks, you get together for 2 days and you all fly and get together. If you say, well, these people geographically live close by, maybe the answer is 1 day a week you go to a workspace together. So I think it's like, what are we actually trying to do? And who are the humans we have? And then the harder question, I think, which is maybe where people are starting to land right now, is what if the humans we have on our team are not well set up to deliver the work we need to do? And one answer is not right for everybody. So there may be people, when you had a physical office, that did very well because they really need to be together. But now your company is virtual or hybrid. Those humans may not be the right fit for your new culture. And that's really hard because they may be extraordinarily good at what they do, but it's just no longer the right culture fit. So my hypothesis is that in the next, 5 years, probably what we'll see is about 15% of the companies go all virtual, about 15% go all in person, and 70% is somewhere in the middle of hybrid. I think that's based on the research I've read and learned about. That's where I think things are going to land. And there's no right or wrong answer, right? It really depends on what you're trying to do and who are the humans you have. And then you use technology to fill in the gaps and to support whatever is best for your group. So I know that's not easy for leaders because they want an answer and they just want to like make a decision and be over with it. But I would just offer that you will lose your competitive edge and you will be less effective in the next 5 to 10 years if you can't wrap your head around this and figure it out for your company or your project or whatever you're working on.
That's a really good framework for folks to move forward with. And I appreciate the idea and probably the impulse that people have of, if we just create a singular solution for the entire company, how easy that will be, right?
Yep, right.
And I've gotten a lot of feedback really in the last, again, probably 12 months, where say that the IT tech team has a different set of procedures that they're working from. And this group sees that as or maybe 1 or 2 people from this group see that as a privilege, like, well, they get to work from home, but it's just not a good fit for what these folks would do. And, often that does land on the leaders to be able to communicate and collaborate on, how does all of this make sense for the whole? These are conversations that were probably avoided, or people were able to just push out because it is so complicated, emotional, personal, and how easy it would be to say, yeah, we're just going to do this, right? So for psychotherapy, I'm glad I don't own a psychotherapy practice today. We would have never thought 5 years ago, 3 years ago, to allow clients and clinicians to just figure out amongst themselves of whether they're going to meet online or in person, right? But it didn't look like that. And now those are active, healthy conversations. And, we're able to reach people in rural areas that don't have the same access. We're able to reach age groups and other demographics that just didn't have the same amount of access. So it is a really complicated new thing that we're all trying to figure out, which then requires these skills that you lay out in the book to just get through some of these conversations.
Yeah, and honestly, we should have had these conversations before. We just didn't. We all kind of accepted the assumptions that things were just a certain way. And, I've been a manager. I find management very difficult, and I have tremendous empathy for managers because I actually think it's very hard. It's a lot easier to manage on time than to task.
Mm-hmm.
So, put your butt in the chair. I can walk and see your butt sitting in the chair. So that means you're doing a good job. Like, that's a lot easier than like, well, what are you doing? How successful are you? I trust you to get it done however you see best, as long as you get it done when I think you need it done by. I mean, that's a lot harder than just, is your butt sitting in that chair? So my hope, I'm an optimist. My hope is that once people take the time, take a hot minute to kind of reevaluate, they're going to see the benefits quickly. They're going to see the productivity. They're going to see their employees being happier and healthier. They're, as managers and leaders, going to feel better. They're going to see results in the bottom line. So my hope is that when you make these changes, you can see it. And so it'll encourage you to keep wanting to put that effort in. But, like I said, I'm an optimist. I know it's really hard and I know it's uncomfortable, and accepting that we're human. The boss is human. The frontline staff is human. Like, unless you're a robot, like, don't treat humans like robots. And that's something we've been doing for a long time. We've been treating humans like robots because corporate America, traditional office came from the Ford factory floor. So that's why we feel like robots, because that's how it was set up. And making that leap to say we're human is uncomfortable for some people. It is very vulnerable to say I'm human, and people worry about their careers. They worry, well, if I'm a human, I'm not superhuman. I'm not going to advance. I'm not going to do well. I'm not going to make enough money. So that's a very real fear that people have.
It seems that the idea of leaders elevating trust as a priority, as a cultural priority, would need to happen for all of this to move forward in a pretty healthy way.
And psychological safety. I mean, that's a prerequisite. Those are table stakes. You won't get anywhere. You're exactly right without those things. And it's a hard time to be a leader right now, too. I know a lot of leaders who behind closed doors say, like, I'm about ready to walk. I'm just going to, decrease my lifestyle expectations so that I can get to a healthier place. So I know it's hard for them too, and they're not going to talk about it because they don't feel like they can talk about it. And that's a shame, because they're people that may leave leadership roles that we need as a society. We need their leadership, and I think it would be very sad if we lose them.
Yeah. I'm wondering, just as we start to close, if someone started in 3 places, so with the idea of stress, like, I'm stressed, I'm burnt out, I'm overwhelmed, my cognitive load, silence. I don't even know the definition of silence, let alone get there. But if someone were to take away from this conversation 3 areas to just start tomorrow, where would you have them start?
Oh, I love that question. I would say 5 minutes. Create 5 minutes in your day, wherever, 5 minutes where you're not doing anything, 5 minutes where you're like going to just go sit and look at a wall or look at the trees, or, 5 minutes, and don't plan what you're going to do with that 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Just commit to the 5 minutes a day for, I don't know, a week or two, and then see what happens. Like, be curious and say, I'm just going to do 5 minutes a day to do nothing, and I'm going to see what happens. I would say that would be my first challenge. I feel like everyone should be able to do that. And you'll be surprised at how hard it is to do 5 minutes.
My brain was already planning what my 5 minutes were going to be. It's like, oh, after this conversation, I'm going to commit to the 5 minutes, but here's going to be my 5 minutes, right? And then my daily brain, so
I'd say that's the first thing. I'd say the second challenge would be, take out your device of choice, which could be your phone or your laptop, and find, I don't know, 3 notifications that you can turn off. Whether maybe not email, that's too ambitious for day one. Maybe it's just turning off some apps, that are notifying you. Maybe it's unsubscribing to 3 emails that come to your box. Like, just 3 things that you can shut out. That would be a challenge. What are 3 things you can turn off maybe a couple times a week? And then the third one, I think, for people who are feeling overwhelmed, would be to take a minute, I think, and ask yourself, like, am I a member of the cult of busyness? And if you are, like, just fess up. I probably still am time to time. Like, just fess up, and maybe even put a sticky note, like, make it funny, add a little humor, maybe write a sticky note to yourself saying, like, I am in the cult of busyness, or I am a cult member, and just put it somewhere that you see. Just something a little humorous, but keep it in front of your eyes for a while and see if anything shifts for you when you start to think of it as a cult. And try to make it a little fun.
That doesn't feel good. Ooh.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, are you a cult member? I mean, maybe you are, maybe you want to be, maybe you don't want to be, but, like, try that and put it in front of your face in some visual way, and just, I don't know, see what happens. Those might be 3 relatively low lift things that somebody could try to just get that curiosity going.
Yeah, that's great. A while back, I tried to figure out a standard answer to when somebody asked me, how are you doing? Because my reflexive
I love that.
Busy, right? And so I'm in the cult of busyness recovery. I'm on the path to recovery, maybe, but it started with this self-awareness that I would reflexively say when somebody would ask me, how are you doing? Oh, busy. Like, oh, what have you been up to? Oh, busy. Right. So I had to, not in those moments, figure out, I wonder what I would say instead.
You know what you can do?
That's why when I read it in the book, I was like, yes.
I have the same thing. And so here's one you can try, Patrick, for fun. So when people say to me all the time, oh, you're a mom and an author and I'm like, how do you're so busy, and thank you for your time. You're so busy. And I say to them, I'm like, you know what? I'm not busy. And I say, my life is full, but I actually feel way less busy than I used to. And normally I get this, like, stunned, they don't even know how to respond to that, because I'm basically negating the idea that I'm in the cult. And it's really a fun little thing to try. So you might try that sometime and see what people say. I say, my life is full, but I feel less busy than I ever have.
That is a healthy reminder. And also just reflecting on my own week. I'm able to pick my kids up from school, and that means that sometimes I start work super early in the morning, but I have the privilege because of that to then hang out with them for hours after school and drive them to all of their sports. And that's a privilege that I get.
Right. And that's the other big call out. I mean, we didn't talk about it today, and I don't put it in the book too much, but all of this is from a position of privilege. Like, there are people who are busy because they are working like 3 jobs just to get food on their table. That is busy. I mean, I think those people, if you say, how are things, and they say busy, they legitimately should be able to say, I'm busy. Whereas I feel like my life is full, but it's not to put food on I mean, I can survive. I could do way less and still survive. So I do also feel like I should call that out, that there are some people that are legitimately busy because that's what they're doing to survive.
Yeah. And I think that cult of busyness is more the virtue signaling of, and you had mentioned this early on in our conversation, of how important I am and how strongly differentiated that is between someone who is struggling to put food on the table. Jennie, this has been great. I'm wondering, I was able to get your book via Kindle, even though I probably could have walked up the road and got it from your house. But I'm wondering where else people could reach out to get their own copy of this. And I know that you have there's a special thing for VIP signed copies as well. Like, how can people engage?
Yeah. So the easiest way to get the book is Amazon. That's where most books are sold. So if you go to Amazon and just search it, Jennie Byrne, Work Smart, you'll find it. There is a ebook on Kindle, a paperback, and a hardcover. If you're interested in getting signed copies of the book, or like a book club or something, a special event, the best place to do that is to go to the book website, which is www.work-smart-book.com. And that has a link to the different packages that are available. And right now I have a promo that you can use if you want to get a 20% off any of the packages. You can use Early Bird 20. So EARLYBIRD 20. And that gives you 20% off any of the packages. So I have an audiobook. I'm in the process to talk about learning new things. I'm recording the audiobook right now. That should be available sometime this summer.
Wonderful. The only social media that I really engage with is LinkedIn, and I see you a lot on there. I didn't know if you were in other spaces that people could check you out.
No, as part of my simplification, I am only social media on LinkedIn. I do have a website where you can see kind of more of an archive of things I've done. So that's www.drjennybyrne, DRJENIEBYRNE.com. That's kind of where you can find an archive. I do have a good amount of stuff on YouTube. So if people like videos, I have a bunch of stuff there too.
Wonderful. Jennie, this has been great. We did not hold to our boundaries. And I think we actually could have went a lot longer as far as time is concerned. Thanks for joining me today.
Yes, thank you. It's always a pleasure, Patrick.